Hi, Tyson. Thank you so much for reaching out. I'm delighted that we have this opportunity to record a podcast episode together today. It's also the very first time that we speak, so I'm really excited about where the conversation will go.
Well, thanks for the invite. I'm excited to wax poetic with you on the way of the world, how things are going, and talk a bit about where we're at today from my perspective.
I think one place I like to start with my guest, and I think it would be interesting also for me to be able to paint a picture of who you are and where you come from, is if I could ask you to travel back in time to your childhood and ask you to recount what was maybe the very first memory that you have of life on this earth, and maybe even what was it like having conversations at the dinner table.
Yeah, what a great question. Honestly, I think it would be very much that dinner table conversation with my mom and my dad. So I have a mother and father and my sister, older sister, who's a professor at the University of Guelph here in Canada. I can vividly remember almost a passive observer in conversations on politics and society and economics with my mom and dad at the dinner table and listening to the news in the background. And so you almost by osmosis start to pick up a real curiosity for the way the world works across all those dimensions and listening to the concerns of what would be typical parents trying to raise their kids in a world that's challenging them from all aspects. And so those are my memories of youth would be and hearing TV shows like MASH in the background and other programs that people of my generation would remember. And I remember really having a lot of admiration for my parents who, say trying to raise a family through interesting times. And I think we all live in interesting times, and learning from them the level of work ethic and effort needed and care, compassion needed to really make a life for themselves.
Yeah, so I heard the word curiosity and observer, and also you hint at maybe a challenging general environment that your parents grew up in. What kind of child were you? What was fascinating you as you were growing up?
A typical kid enjoyed playing with friends and sports and outside, but where I had a real interest and a real curiosity was my grandfather on my mother's side and his brothers were all World War II vets.
Hmm.
And my grandfather Herring, on my mother's side, essentially became a bit of a father figure, brother figure to me. And I became fascinated with the history of World War II, the events that led up to the war, and then became really curious in my teenage years around the whole aspect of intelligence and what led to decision making for certain
Hmm.
events. And so that fed the curiosity that bled me into university, where I was really interested in kind of geopolitical, socioeconomic, military intelligence type studies, and that drove my passion for trying to figure out how the world works ultimately.
Hmm. Hmm. And I'm fascinated as well by the influence that grandparents seem to have on us. I've recorded about 125 episodes of this podcast, and I've started trying to draw parallels between guests. And a large majority of guests refer to their grandparents actually as one of the foundational influences in their life. So I'd love if you could share a bit about maybe the worldview that was starting to take shape. Obviously, I know that our conversation will touch on your professional life and the topic of risks. So I'm gently trying to navigate here about what kind of worldview actually was emerging, or what was the one that your grandfather had.
Well, and it's fascinating. I think I would wonder on the people that you've spoken with. I wonder if it's the same kind of sociological, psychological situation where I believe grandparents, at least in my experience anyway, I believe that they see a grandchild as an opportunity to impose wisdom or to share wisdom that maybe they didn't share with their own children, and so they have a second chance to impart wisdom in a way that maybe they could have or wanted to the first time. So I think we benefit from that. I think grandchildren benefit from the wisdom of grandparents, and there's probably a more open conversation with the grandchild, knowing that at the end of the day they can simply hand the grandchild back to the parent and be on with their day. So for me, I mean, my grandfather was one to really talk about. He never really talked about the horribleness of war. I have to be
Mm,
honest.
mm,
Wanted to stay more into some of the more interesting stories around war, but he certainly wanted to impart on me that it was something that he hoped would never happen again. It was something that he hoped the world leaders around us are able to think through and make decisions that avoid it.
Mm.
He knows he was fortunate to make it through. He knows he was fortunate to come out. He lost a lot of friends and along the way over those years, and so what fascinated me was how dependent they were on the decision makers around them and above them to send where they sent them and for decisions to go where they went. He for example, he was in the Navy, and he was in the landing of Dieppe, which of course was a military disaster from the Allied perspective and from an intelligence perspective. But he followed orders and did what he was told, and tried to find ways to make the best of a worse situation. But again, it comes back to that whole leadership and decision making aspect of any type of leadership in the world, but especially when it comes to human capital being placed in such a position. So it was fascinating. It really opened a curiosity for war studies, intelligence studies, and honestly, I think he probably shared more with me than I think he shared with his own daughter over what happened in the years of the war.
Fascinating. And if I try to connect that with your career, looking at what I could find about it, the impression I had is it doesn't feel like you changed professions really, but more like you kept asking ever bigger questions. Is that something that resonates? And what would be the thread that connects everything?
I think that's a really fair view of my career. And, I've been meaning to update. It's funny, LinkedIn, for example, I've never added my intelligence side to my career on LinkedIn. I think that will need to change. But I think you're very accurate. And that is, I've always enjoyed and have been, energized by the ability to help an organization achieve its objectives. And if my value add is around risk management, how to help an organization optimize while still avoiding as much risk as they can or mitigating as much risk as they can. And while that started in the intelligence world for the government of Canada, it moved into industry after that. And so I was fascinated when I was in government, obviously worked in the intelligence world. And again, I'll make sure that is updated, but passionate about that, but also had a real kind of an ever learning zest, almost like a white belt mentality around learning. And so, and a real drive to see how the world works. And so I exited the intelligence service and ended into private industry. Again, to your point, it's all around risk management, optimizing to avoid as much risk as possible and identify risk. And I was fascinated by the way that you manage and assess risk. Worked in big bank, but then I felt I was missing pieces and quite frankly, knew I had gaps in my knowledge base. And that probably takes me, as this part of the journey, it takes me into my GMAP world. When I left the big bank and went to work for a global electronics manufacturer and really had an opportunity to understand the way the world works. And that's what really inspired me to take my Global Master of Arts program degree at Fletcher.
I'd love if you could share how your understanding of risk evolved, especially since you had that perspective from the secrecy of government intelligence and then moving into the private sector. So physical security to then corporate enterprise risk, cyber, AI, geopolitics. So how has your, if you remember those first few years in intelligence, what was the understanding of risk at that time, and how did you see that evolve?
Great question. I believe, like any young professional, we don't realize at the time, but we're probably much more naive than we think we are. And I would argue, as a young intelligence officer, I believed that the kind of insights I was able to obtain were quite holistic and fairly global. And so I applied as the best I could the training and the knowledge that I had at the time. But I soon began to realize that there were additional dimensions to risk. So probably really, really strong in human intelligence, signals intelligence, and geopolitical pieces while you're in the intelligence world. Then, international law, finance, macroeconomics, microeconomics, fiscal policies, pieces that you didn't really get introduced to in the intelligence world, working in your counterterrorism side, that began to creep in. And whether that was through terrorist financing and international banking law. And so you realized there are other dimensions here that I haven't even learned about. And so that fascinated me. While I was in the intelligence world, I actually went and obtained my certified fraud examiner's designation because I knew there was a whole piece around the way that money travels the world and how that operates that I needed to understand more of. So I was curious about that. So I kept kind of pulling on threads that I identified, and that kind of continued throughout my career.
And when were you maybe most out of your depth?
Every time I feel like every time I start into a new career path, I'm out of my depth. And over the years, I'd say I'm not a big fan of status quo. I love to feel out of my depth. And so I try to stretch pretty regularly into my out of my depths. But I think my biggest out of depth has to be, without a doubt, I left government and I joined a Canadian Tier 1 bank. Things were going well there. I entered as a bit of a subject matter expert in a particular area. And then I'm sure what happens to some people, you get promoted into a place you have no idea what you're doing. So I was promoted beyond my capabilities, and I was really treading water. And the phone rang one day, and I will never forget this. The phone rang one day, and it was a gentleman who I'd had the pleasure of working with on a previous project within the bank. Didn't even work in the same sector, but he was kind of a senior executive in a different sector. And he called one day and he said, I congratulations, I see you've been promoted. I said, yes, I have. And he said, how are you doing? And I fumbled through a very diplomatic answer. And then he said, would you like a mentor? And that was, to me, that was somebody throwing me a life preserver out as I was treading water. So of course my answer was an immediate yes. And that started my journey into being mentored and understanding about leadership and how to think different about management and leadership. And hallelujah, because I was very much fumbling through that completely.
So how did that story and that event change you actually?
So fundamentally it changed me. So he started to take me through a few leadership books, and we would do chapter by chapter. We would meet weekly and discuss the chapter and how it applies to my work and my team. It had me think different about supporting and managing others and leading others. It also, I had the very good fortune as well in that particular position of having a few other mentors that kind of surrounded me. People who've worked with me will, if they're listening to this, they're gonna hear me repeat a phrase that I've learned or that I've repeated times. And I was frustrated at one point trying to obtain an objective by working with a couple of different business units. Because when you're a subject matter expert, when you're that SME, everything is black and white, and you have the ability to impose black and white because that's what you've been hired for. As soon as you jump into management rank, leadership rank, the whole piece around collaboration and finding path forwards collaboratively didn't come easy to me. And so I remember being in a meeting one day, being in a mentorship meeting, and asked for my thoughts on a particular topic, and I was frustrated. And the comment was, Tyson, you can be dead right, and then you can be right. And problem is, you're dead right. You're not collaborative. You're not engaging others. You're not listening to their perspectives and their concerns. And you're not finding a path forward that gets you to where you need to get to while still respecting the collaborative aspects of your other partners. And so massive eye opener for me.
Wow.
And I'll say that the journey for the 15 years since that, the whole area around collaborative leadership and empowering leadership has been a game changer for me mentally and psychologically as I grow.
Thank you for sharing that, because it sounds like your superpower that allowed you to be successful as a subject matter expert, this being dead right, turned out to be a bit of a shadow as you became a leader. And you hint at how tough that change has been. So how have you been, or how have you become a different leader over time? And is that shadow side of you still there, or have you turned into something very different?
It's still there. I guess I have the self-awareness now to recognize and try to get out in front of it on a more regular basis. I've become an avid reader, trying to find ways to learn how to be better continuously, and it's a constant journey for me. Stoicism in the last few years has been a powerful tool for me in terms of my approach to to managing, my level of self-awareness. Temperance as part of the four Stoic virtues has been one that I really try and double down on a regular basis. I'm still working on it. I think if I'm being honest, I've come a long way, but I certainly know that I have more to do, more ways to grow, and but I find that's a really nice way for me to kind of recenter on what's important and how to engage properly. And I try and do that on a daily basis. And I think that level of self awareness that you gain over the years as you allow yourself to receive feedback and critique and do that with all the right intentions to become better. I think that's a really important piece. The other one is, I would argue, that I learned probably 10 years ago now is really no ego. Like, leave the ego at the door.
Hmm.
Come in with the best intentions to support your team to achieve a mandate and work with others. And if you bring in people with similar philosophies around you and you build a right team, you can achieve some pretty incredible milestones.
As somebody who's traveled a long way from a leadership journey, with that self-awareness piece and with learning to recognize ego, how do you help younger leaders with growing their self-awareness and with that recognizing ego? Are there tools or are there ways? How do you do that for like hungry 30-year-olds who have almost none?
It's such a great question. I actually default back to that pivotal phone call where it was like, would you like a mentor? So I try and identify people that I believe have incredible skill sets and opportunities for growth, which are hopefully most of the people that you're bringing into your organization. And then I do invest in mentorship. I do invest in working with these future leaders, and it's really identifying certain leadership books or finding common ground that you can then work on discussion. So a weekly check-in where you're asking them, what do you think about this topic or this subject, or how did you approach that meeting, or what worked for you, or how are you feeling? Quite often it comes up pretty quick in terms of, as soon as you get people into positions where they have to increase their levels of collaboration, those that are in, those people you hired because they were absolute, subject matter experts and operated in that defined black and white space. It's a common frustration for a lot of them that they ended up really enjoying the ability to have increased self-awareness and understand how things work when it comes to growth, leadership, and collaboration. So mentorship, I think, is big. And honestly, it's kind of a pay it forward mentality. Someone helped me out, and I feel I want to help others out as well now.
Thank you for sharing that. I'd like to go back a bit in the topic of risk. You spoke or hinted at your experience in the counterterrorism side of intelligence, which to me as a non-government person now sounds like a really nerve-wracking challenge to grapple with that uncertainty that can have disastrous consequences on the lives of people in your country. And then you moved into the corporate side. And so one question that comes up a bit to me is, are organizations, both government and private sector, still kind of preparing for yesterday's risks?
That's a really good question. I would, in my experience in public and private sector and working for some large organizations, I would argue that I think one of the challenges is that multidimensional risk is overwhelming for a lot of organizations. So I would argue many organizations struggle with forward-looking, proactive risk management, and the comfort zone is one of reactive risk management. And so it's tough to, I think one of the other big failings too in the risk management space over the years for a lot of professionals is the struggle to explain risk to the business professionals who are running organizations. And so there's a loss in translation component, and then there's a complexity component, and both become very important for the risk part of the organization to be able to articulate in business terms, and also to have the ability to understand the complexity of risk. Like when I first started years ago, cyber risk wasn't even on the table. Okay. So there was an entire domain of risk that wasn't relevant at the time. And that has exploded over the last 15 to 20 years. It still is manifesting. The lines are getting blurrier now between what used to be very clear, state sponsors of terrorism and terrorist groups, to now where did the lines blend and get really foggy real quick when it comes to international pressure on activities around the world, whether it's geopolitical, etc., and how the leveraging of proxies to put pressures. Like, it has become much more complex. But yet at the same time, if you understand the complexity, now with the tools and the technology available, you can actually potentially get more insights into the complexity. So it's been a dynamic, ever-changing risk environment, I would argue. But I think the tricky part for organizations is understanding it and having it articulated in ways that resonate. And also, the other piece about risk is, if it's constant doomsday reporting, with no action plans, you very quickly get the switch turned off on you, because here comes Tyson again with bad news. But if it's insights that can be actioned to help optimize revenue, optimize efficiency, and drive risk avoidance, now you have a seat at the table, and now people want to listen to what you have to say.
Yeah, I find that fascinating, what the spotlight that you put on this need to translate, as opposed to kind of be the one with the red flag all the time. And there's obviously that tension between dealing with risk from a resilience standpoint versus the efficiency element as well. Maybe I'd love to ask, what surprises you the most about how organizations respond to uncertainty?
Well, I think the easiest thing for organizations to do when it comes to de-risking without too much insight is to ensure. So it's to have a ability to recover, or to potentially just avoid taking certain actions. And so the problem with risk avoidance and risk recovery, or loss recovery, is that you don't necessarily optimize on the business side of things, right? So I think that's the safest cocooned approach to take. The organizations that tend to be incredibly successful, from what I've seen, are the ones who say, how do we work with full knowledge of the risk and find ways to grow while mitigating as best we can? And are there new and innovative ways to do that? I'll go back to my years at Celestica, an electronics manufacturer globally. And again, another kind of turning point for me was when I first parachuted in there and started to travel and visit their different facilities. I realized pretty quickly that it's not a one-size-fits-all for an organization like this, and that the nuances of risk in different countries around the world are something that can't be remedied by a generic risk assessment platform sitting back in my head office in Toronto. That's what I'd say led me into the Fletcher world, where I knew I needed to understand more. And so now my perspectives on risk when it comes to global operations also have regional context. And I think that's incredibly important. My ability to understand risk from a regional business perspective and the nuances of operating in certain parts of the world have to factor back into the action plans. Otherwise, like I mentioned earlier, they'll turn the switch off on you and not listen to you. You don't understand their business and the regional nuances of their business. How could you possibly articulate the best way to avoid risk and optimize the business? And so, lesson learned there was, if you don't understand the regional situation, it's hard for you to say that you're articulating the best risk management strategy.
I like how you shared, when you moved from the government side to the private sector, your mind was opened up to a whole bunch of other subjects and elements. You talked about macroeconomics and fiscal aspects, etc. When did you start thinking in systems? Was that the moment? And also, have you always naturally seen connections that others miss?
Certainly not. I put it this way: I knew I was missing something, and so I do give great kudos to my time at Fletcher for opening my eyes and helping me connect dots. I knew I was missing. I knew there were gaps in knowledge. I knew there were pieces I wasn't understanding. And my ability to then, I'd say I was looking at a giant gestalt. I was looking at a giant puzzle with a whole bunch of missing pieces. I knew the pieces were missing, and I knew it was important for me to figure out what those pieces were so I could see what the image truly was. And so I had a lot of learning to do. And The whole pieces around macrofinance and macroeconomics, it didn't come easy to me. Probably some of the hardest studying I've ever had to do in my life is to get my brain to wire to understand those concepts. But even things like understanding how a multinational makes decisions on tax strategy into different geographies that may impact what type of operations they would run there. And so if you don't understand that, if you don't have at least the kind of overall understanding of how those decisions might get made and what factors into those. So for me, I was very self-aware on the fact I had major gaps in my knowledge base and I wanted to fill those in.
Mm-hmm.
Certainly, I certainly wouldn't say I'm someone who saw systems that others don't, but I would argue that maybe today, what I've tried to put myself in a position to do is to have a holistic enough view across multiple dimensions that I can offer as much value as possible when it comes to articulating what the risk picture looks like for a particular organization.
And it sounds like in the period that we're entering now, the number of domains that leaders have to consider at once to be able to make business decisions is just increasing exponentially, factoring in energy, supply chain, regional dynamics, and how all of these topics collapse into one cloud. I'm curious, how have you experienced leaders making decisions without certainty?
Really good question. I think we're probably entering a time of maybe the most uncertainty. I just think with the destabilization of what were previously very, very stable partners around the world. Speaking as a Canadian, I think that's really put a shock into the system. I think leaders now need to rethink supply chain, trade partners. Diversification has a whole different connotation, especially for some of the Western countries in the world. That's tough. And that's actually, I think, very scary. And I've firsthand seen or worked with particular leaders who are very engaged in that and are embracing it, even though it's very tricky and tough. And I've seen others who kind of recoil back into a comfortable cocoon around something a bit more domestic. And you probably can't fault either one of them for their decision. I think both have consequences, and it's maybe incumbent upon the risk executives around them to help them see the right path forward. It is a very scary time right now, I believe, for a lot of organizations. However, there's never been more opportunity in the world as well. Matter of how do you articulate it from the opportunity perspective, not just the risk perspective.
I'm amazed that we've managed to last half an hour in this conversation without the word AI coming up. So I think let's put it on the table. I'm very curious as well about your perspective, your take on AI in the future, and especially with that experience that you bring. Is this a technology challenge or a leadership?
Such a good question. I'm going to lean on the leadership side of it. I'm going to suggest that AI is an incredibly powerful tool, and tools, are the mediums through which great things can be done, and they're the mediums through which negative things can occur. I heard a great speech from an author, Chaudhry, who wrote a book called Reshuffle, and I believe he's actually from Southeast Asia. But he had an incredible keynote a few months back at a conference I was attending, and I, to the point where I bought the book, read it, and then I gave it to a lot of my executive team at the time where I was working in the financial services sector. Ultimately, the concept that it came down to was think about AI. When you think of AI, sit down and look at your business today and identify all your constraints. What are the constraints you have in execution, the constraints you have in data, the constraints you have, that if you're able to remove those constraints, you'd be much more efficient, and your efficiency and your ability to scale would be optimized, okay? If you do the homework in advance of jumping into AI, you'll find that AI then becomes an enabler for you rather than owner of your brain. And so for organizations that jump too quickly into allowing everyone to play in the AI space, I think they miss a real opportunity to train, support, and guide an organization or people into the right way to think about leveraging AI versus kind of giving away your own power and your own abilities to the engine for it to then tell you what to say and what to do. So I don't blame the tool. I blame the people around the tool and how we're thinking about data and governance and the constraints that we're trying to remove from business. But it'll be an ongoing challenge. I'm quite fascinated by it. I get to work in it right now with my current
Mm.
contract gig that I'm working on. With Improbable Worlds, we're sitting right at the forefront of data, AI, LLMs, and kind of geopolitical issues. And if you leverage the tools for the right perspectives, it can really be a force multiplier for what you're trying to achieve. But if you let it run wild without your guardrails in place, you can head down some pretty scary rabbit holes pretty quick.
I'd love if we can open that topic up a bit more, actually. Maybe you mentioned some of this work that you're doing excites you. Can you share more? What excites you?
So I think what excites me about it is you have an opportunity. So if you're looking at the dimensions of technology, data, models for insights and driving intelligence, you've never had a more powerful opportunity to leverage technology and techniques for insight. It's the level of complexity on risk has never been more dynamic, but also your ability to put your arms around it
Mm.
and figure out what it's all about. So one of the things that we're working on now is the ability to say, okay, if we have the multiple domains of, geopolitical, socioeconomic, and cyber risk management aspects to the way the world works, there are well-heeled models and peer-reviewed models of prediction and predictive insights into what causes conflict that have been going on for decades, but also the new cyber realm. Well, if you were to take those really mature, insightful models and you were to build LLMs around them and figure out if you had certain signal, what could you learn from that signal that would support the model? And then you aggregate the models together and you let AI power the ability to run the analytics. Again, you're using the technology for its intended purpose. The insights that you can receive are quite powerful. Your ability to almost force multiply what would probably have taken an entire team of analysts weeks to figure out or to curate or to develop. If you build it correctly, you can get there very quickly. The tricky part is obviously feeding continued signal into the machine so that it can tell you the ongoing state of affairs. But to even have the abilities to generate those types of insights across multiple domains of risk for validation of models that have been sitting on shelves for years is a very exciting opportunity. So if you look at people who have documented the history of semantic analysis in the lead up to the Yugoslav war or other
Mm.
types of events in history that have now been well documented, and they become incredible models that you could use to predict whether a certain country was heading towards conflict or not. Those have never been leveraged, perhaps in the way that AI can help leverage
Mm.
those models. So that's what I find very exciting.
And then on the other side, since you're at the table with very influential decision makers, what frustrates you in terms of maybe conversations that leaders are not having?
Well, I think, like I mentioned earlier, I think certain leaders are out of their comfort. And like I mentioned, I don't think you can be a leader today and not be out of your comfort zone. I think every leader today that wants to grow its respective business or keep its business optimized is going to be into an area of innovation and growth, which is outside of status quo. So I guess my frustration would be any leader that decides now is the time to, shelter in place, I'll say, I think would be a very frustrating engagement, especially for the way I think. I don't think sheltering in place is what's going to get you through this. I think the ability to innovate and identify opportunity and risk and make the right decisions to avoid risk and optimize opportunities is your only path forward. I think the days of sitting quietly domestically or sitting quietly internationally thinking that this will blow over. I think, the Canadian Minister Mark Carney explained it very nicely in Davos about the kind of the new reality of the world. And I think that's something that leaders need to embrace. So I think the frustration would be, I could forecast that frustration for a lot of risk executives would be, or, innovation executives would be leadership that decides to shelter in place versus embrace the changes that are coming and work to better understand and make decisions that allow them to be agile and optimize.
Yeah. And if we put the spotlight back on you, what would you say has changed the most about you?
I think my level of understanding of risk has grown immensely since my, very first days in government back before the world was where it was today. I can see a significant increase in awareness and knowledge. The other thing that I believe is fascinating for me anyway is I believe as much as I have learned and increased my knowledge base, I still have a lot to understand and a lot of nuances to figure out. And so I'm, pleased to see where I've grown to, but I still try and add additional dimensions to my knowledge. And I believe that's it's almost a conscious passion of mine to increase my level of understanding.
Mm-hmm. And what question are you wrestling with today?
So as I get into my 50s here, I'm into my 51st year. My question to it now is, how can I be of most value? How can I take the skills and insights that I've worked hard to build up over the years and add the most value possible to society? So how can I be of greatest benefit going forward? And that's something that I wrestle with, and is that right now it's designing a new platform that will help engage and provide greater awareness into the state of the world for civil society. I've worked, like I say, to help large financial institutions manage risk to ensure that their customers have access to their capital, access to the resources, so that they can live their best lives. So I'm always trying to figure out what's the most value I can add, and I really wrestle with that, and I want to make sure that before my professional years have completed, I'm able to say that I made every effort possible to provide as much value as I could while I was still able to do it.
If your younger self met you today, what would you say would surprise him the most?
Probably my approach to collaboration and engagement. I think my younger Tyson was incredibly hard-headed and driven in a singular direction, and probably sitting down with a younger version of myself today, they might be confused or a little bit interested in the approach to things that are a bit more multidimensional and collaborative. I think that would be the biggest change, and obviously more hair. I'd have a lot more hair.
You mentioned that you do quite a lot of giving back, at least in terms of your time and guidance to younger people. I've reached the age where it's happening to me a lot, where I start being asked by people who are at school in university or very early in their career for advice, and I'm stumped now. I find it extremely difficult to provide any relevant guidance that applies to how should young people make decisions or trust luck and pivot. So what do you say yourself?
Yeah, and I can appreciate where you're coming from. I guess where I would try and root, or where I try and root in my conversations, and I have a almost 21-year-old son that I get to use as my guinea pig on all mentoring. And I'd say
I hope he's doing fine.
Yeah, he's doing great. I'd say core values don't change. I'd say making sure that the core values around, courage, justice, wisdom, temperance, strong work ethic, moral compass, I think those are key pieces that you can always reinforce. And then after that, I think I would continue to challenge people to look at different aspects and look at things differently from different perspectives, understand how others are approaching conversations and discussions, and then lifelong learning. I believe that has probably been the single biggest aspect of my growth, has been my openness and my curiosity for lifelong learning. I believe people who turn that switch off at a young age miss out on massive opportunities to expand how they understand and how they can grow.
Thanks. Thank you so much, Tyson, for this conversation. We have a tradition at the end of the podcast of 3 quick-fire question and answers, but before I do that, is there anything else that you wanted to share, or any question you wish I had asked you but didn't?
No, I mean, I guess one of the key pieces I'd love to share, and I know we're both fellow Fletcher alumni, I think there's never been a time in the world in my life where the people with the ability to have the eclectic insights and the ability to understand how things are operating, there's never been a time more important than now. I believe the ability for critical thinking among youth and people in general today has never been more required. And the ability for people to reinforce independent thinking and critical thinking, I believe, is absolutely at its height right now. And I think we could make some big errors in the world today if we allow technology to be our mind instead of still having our own critical thinking and leveraging technology for that purpose. I think that would be a key message I want to make sure it comes out of the conversation.
Thanks. I'm going to go ahead with these three quick quick fire question and answer. The first one is anything that you've read recently, a book, article, billboard that has maybe shifted the way you see the world.
So I read a book that I believe is from the 1970s. It's called Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance.
The famous one, yeah.
I recommend that. I was so impressed. I just happened to see it on the shelf while I was looking for my next set of books, and I picked it up, and I have to say I was fascinated by it. It's a great read, and I think it puts life in perspective. And I think by the end of it, the key message is be the best version of yourself you can be, and bring that version, to the world every day.
Second question is, I'm really interested in habits, rituals, or even life hacks. Is there one that you practice or cultivate that has improved your life?
Absolutely. I journal every morning. So before my day starts, especially, work days, I make sure that I sit down and I journal. And I have a couple of books, and one is for a reflection of the day that was. And then another one is for actively reminding myself or repositioning myself for the day ahead to make sure that I have my best headspace possible actively for what's in front of me, whether that's upcoming meetings, or maybe it's a medical appointment, or maybe it's a hard conversation, or whatever it is that's happening to you. I find that journaling, to be able to be in front of that mentally and position yourself correctly for how to approach that, helps make sure that you operate as your best self. So I would highly recommend that.
Thanks. And my last question is, what's the first thing that comes to mind if I ask about a place that has a special significance to you?
So I'd say Ottawa. I was born in Ottawa. My grandfather, who I mentioned, was like a brother to me. He had a little fishing camp on a river nearby, and I used to spend my summers there. So I would say Ottawa, Ontario, has that initial impact when you ask me.
Thank you so much, Tyson, for this wonderful conversation.
Thank you for the opportunity, and I look forward to talking again in the future.